This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is a behavioral scientist. She's an expert on technology, relationships, couples, and sexuality. Whew, this sounds right up my alley. I mean, I know probably as much as you know out there. My guest today, Michelle Drouin, she knows a little bit more. So we will lean into her and see what we can figure out today. Where are we going today? As Michelle calls it, we're in the middle of an intimacy famine, whether that's sexual intimacy, family intimacy, friends intimacy, whatever intimacy. This crossroads where intimacy and technology are overlapping, are fundamentally changing us. The question, is it a good change? Not all. We all know that instinctively. But where are we possibly headed? What can we do? It's always fun to jump in and have a conversation with an individual who dives deep into sex research. And without any further delay or build-up from me, let's jump right into my conversation today with Michelle Drouin and figure out how we can solve the dilemma of being out of touch. I hope you enjoy this episode. This is a topic that's, okay, maybe the solution could be controversial. Maybe the diagnosis could be controversial, or people would disagree. But the topic, where you have jumped into, the idea that we're in the middle of an intimacy famine on all fronts, I don't think anyone can disagree with that.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if they did, especially since the last couple of years we've been in the throes of a pandemic. Everyone has felt a little bit isolated and empty. But I think that it started even before that. I think that might be the controversial part, whether the technology was already pushing us towards this place.
I'm sure it was. It has been. I'm a guy who started an online business in 1996, less than a year, or maybe about a year after Netscape went public, right in the middle of the dot-com era. And I got to do that kind of business online between, let's say, 95, 96 until Facebook. It was different. Facebook changed everything because Facebook gave everybody a website, so to speak. Most people did not use that website for business. They used it to show off, to play, to communicate.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of people are using it to socialize, but that socialization can be really passive. A lot of people, I think, just scroll through their feeds, occasionally throwing a like or a comment on. You have some really active users who'll be posting all the time. But in terms of the immersiveness of the medium, it's pretty shallow. People can leave all of that scrolling just feeling like there isn't a lot of depth. I always call it the People magazine about your friends.
We don't want to think of it like that, but when you lay it out like that, and we all kind of hear you lay it out like that, we all have to agree.
Well, I would think a lot of people would agree. Maybe not Facebook. Maybe they would think that we're having a more immersive experience. And as it goes into the metaverse, I think maybe that will change. But as it is now, what I likened it to recently was if your life is a pool and your daily existence is the pool cover, most of the time we're just throwing marbles on that pool cover. It's not ever really penetrating us. Those likes, those comments, that scrolling, that's what it's doing. But once in a while, we need those bowling balls to, I think, really feel human.
Do you know how I have I don't really have a Twitter addiction. I mean, I use it for business, but I think Facebook, I like to use it as my personal diary. And if people like to read what I say about whatever topic, okay, that's great, but I do it more for myself. But I would have to say something interesting happened to me on Facebook, and it might have clipped my desire. I'm one of the people, which I'm sure it's in the billions now, the way this AI algorithm is working, but I linked to a non-controversial CDC government report about COVID, and I got suspended for 2 days and put on a 30-day lower to the feed thing. And at that moment, I said to myself, hold on, what am I doing here? What is this? This is kind of weird.
It was just a CDC, like a mask mandate or something.
It was some CDC report. I don't know if it was controversial or not. It was on the CDC website. It woke me up to the idea, because then I all of a sudden started seeing this is happening to everybody. These AI algorithms are searching for whatever the owners of Facebook view as the prescribed right way to say whatever it is about whatever topic. When you realize you're in the middle of that, you're kind of like, well, hold on, maybe I don't want to be in the middle of that. That might be my out.
That's powerful. I mean, what you experienced personally was the way that media shapes your own voice. And you probably already were cognizant that it was shaping what you consume. Even your feed is algorithmically matched to what they think you want to see. Your news sources are becoming matched to what you want to see. But when it happens to you, I think it just really puts that into your face that media is shaping you. And do you want to be part of that?
I'm not being all that, but as a guy who's written 6 books, who's made a documentary film, thousands of blog posts, and 1,000+ podcast episodes, that's the first time in my life as an American I've ever been censored. That was like, okay, maybe at the very end, we'll talk about that again. Let me ask you if you've seen something recently. Have you seen this documentary on Netflix? And you know which one I'm talking about. Have you seen this thing? Tinder Swindler?
Oh, the Tinder Swindler, yes.
Have you seen it?
I did. I watched it recently. And then I attended a workshop where some psychologists were talking about how interesting it would have been to do psychological analyses on the Tinder Swindler. We were talking about one particular test, a psychological test.
I thought it was interesting on all fronts. I think if people are being honest and they're really being objective and they're looking at what was said and how people communicated and what their desires were, obviously the guy should be in jail. Okay, no one's going to disagree with that. But the ladies, they should not be in jail or anything like that. Of course, they didn't do anything wrong except be stupid. But I didn't walk away with a good feeling about anybody, really. I mean, I just saw the whole thing was terrible in terms of, wow, is this where we are? Is this life? And so I bring it up because I know that it does dovetail into where you're going. I thought that was like an interesting place to jump into. How do you feel about it?
Some of my research a few years ago was looking at how honest people think other people are online and how honest they were online. I had a really compelling quote that I started one of my articles with, and it said something like, online, you can be anything you want to be. I can be thin. I can have a family who loves me. I can be the most interesting person. I don't have to be everything that I am offline. I think that people really recognize that. The veil of the internet, I think, is good for some people because having that veil allows them to express who they really are. Maybe you don't need that. It sounds like you're a guy with a lot of confidence, but if you're more socially anxious, maybe it would give you just enough anonymity or asynchronicity to really think about what you want to say and say it in a way that doesn't make you anxious.
I brought up the Tinder Swindler in terms of thinking about intimacy. I'm watching this and I'm thinking, okay, the first lady, I can't recall her name, but the first lady brings up her story and she's got 1,000 matches on Tinder. She worships the idea of Disney movies and that idealized fantasy, love, romance, something like that. All of that laid the groundwork that a complete con artist could come into her life and swindle her. It doesn't surprise me there's con men out there. They're out there a dime a dozen, okay, right? It's more sad on the female side of that's where we could be. What it made me wonder, and I want to ask you, if you've got a sense of this, what's your female perspective on the Tinder Swindler?
Yeah, a lot of people, not only women, will do anything for love. I see these women as taking these small steps at first, but remember, there was a lot of seduction that happened. They were whisked away. And you're right to say there were these Disney-like vibes to his whole method of seduction where he had, although this wasn't Disney, private jets and big parties and extravagant dinners and just really grand gestures. You're saying as if these Disney vibes, these are common. I mean, there are children who are still growing up with Disney. I certainly did. To fall for it seems to me kind of natural that someone might fall for it. You're sifting through all of this noise, and there is a lot of noise. So if you find someone who stands out in some way, I think it's pretty attractive. I can kind of see what these women fell for initially. They fell for a fairy tale.
But the men in your life all said, no, we can see the guy was a scam from the very beginning.
Yeah, we can now, especially the first girl. The first trip she took with him, she took with his ex-wife and his daughter. And she was saying how having this child there felt like very legitimate. And even online, we look for what's called warrants. So connections to the real world that can help verify who someone is. That seems like a pretty positive one, a pretty solid one, I think. They were going with people who were members of his family. And apparently the ex-wife vouched for him and said he was a really great guy. He still took care of his family. And I think in each case, these women had some indication that who he was real. Now it all seems obvious to us as we see what's happening simultaneously in his life. But remember, these women saw only one side of him. They didn't see how he was doing the extravagant parties with other people. They just saw that he needed money.
Let me flip the script to that. If I was to be going out on a first date or first couple dates and a woman said, we're going to go on her private jet with her child and her ex-husband, I would not be going. Intimacy does not only go to the male-female connection area, but let's start there because I think it's an interesting place to start because that's really what we're driving at right now. Let's face it. We're talking about men. We're talking about women. We all know since this technology has hit our lives that, okay, as you say at the beginning, it's kind of skin deep. We see more. We think we have more choice. We think we're interacting more, but it's an illusion. It's not really real. It's a lot of choice. I don't know what it's a lot of choice of.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And that's something I wanted to say. There are all these different facets of intimacy first. A lot of people think only of sex, but it's not just sex. You could have other physical intimacy that is not sex, holding hands, giving a hug. You can stand next to someone really closely, and that could be intimate. And then you have intellectual intimacy, sharing ideas, opinions. You have social intimacy, sharing your feelings. There even spiritual intimacy, experiential intimacy. You have all these different facets of intimacy. And I think it is an illusion that you could go on and quickly garner that from your socio-technical world. I think the really immersive experiences are the ones that actually give you what we really crave as humans, which is those feelings of deep connection, the feeling of being loved. I just don't think that people from their normal scrolling will come away feeling loved.
It's a crazy time. Having myself, spending a lot of time in Asia in the last 5, 6, 7 years. It's an entirely different dynamic between men and women. Now, of course, something like Tinder is just as popular here as it is in America, but the dynamic between men and women is different. And I think that's something that we all don't think about around the world is the dynamic. Where do you think the dynamic on intimacy is at this current moment in time between men and women in America? I'll add one more caveat to that. If we were just voting in America, the political parties kind of make this argument. The political parties, it's the battle of the sexes, really. They're very different. Generally, more women are voting left and generally more men are voting right. How do you see intimacy in America at this moment in time between men and women?
A couple of years ago, I would have given a different answer. But in the last couple of years, what we've seen is both men and women edging towards a commonality where they both want deeper connection. I think the dating scene was really disrupted during COVID, obviously. People started questioning, why am I spending all this time online? These relationships are going nowhere. I don't know if you know this, but there's been a decline in sex among young adults. The young adults now, the millennials, are having less sex than their parents did at that age. I think this is linked to a decline in committed relationships. So a lot of relationships may not be getting deep enough, although we have this mind of a Tinder culture. Certainly sociosexual values have changed so that all kinds of one-night stands and hookups are much more acceptable than they were 20 or 30 years ago. Nonetheless, I think a lot of people are just not getting to the point in their relationships where they're actually having sex. I think there's a rebound effect happening now where people are wanting a little bit more of a serious relationship. And I think that's men and women. I know there's all this talk about the masculine energy and the feminine energy and how those are different and complementary, but I don't know if I buy it. I think that both men and women are equally wanting novelty in these one night stands and then also wanting the stability of a committed relationship where they could really just hang out with someone. What do you see in Asia?
It's complicated. Those kinds of issues will cross borders. I'll come back to a thought from myself, but there was something I wanted to address as you were laying that out with younger generations and less sex. So here I am. I can think back to being, I don't know, 10, 11, 12. At that point in time, if guys were looking at pornography, it was Playboy Penthouse magazines. Now you've got a situation where I don't even want to imagine what my nephews have seen. Really. And they're teenagers. I don't want to imagine what they've seen because I know how bad everything is out there. I know what's out there. But how does an onslaught of pornography affect also the younger generation and sex? Are they potentially watching so much porn they are incapable of intimacy?
That's an argument that some people make. You bring up a really excellent point. I'm a developmental psychologist. My perspective on all of this is how is it affecting us as humans and us as we grow? This has been a question that I've been thinking about for a long time. We don't have enough longitudinal studies to really see how it's affecting young children as they grow and how it shapes their views of intimacy and even sexuality. But we do know that exposure to pornography changes all kinds of things. It changes what you want. It changes your sexual desire. For some people, it might even lead to sex avoidance if they experience a lot of anxiety around their own porn use. It causes habituation. There are people who have sexual dysfunction based on habitual porn use. I do know among adult samples that there are a lot of studies that have come out that have said it just changes the way we think about sex. I too, am the mother of two teenage boys, and I grew up in the same generation as you did, where the only sexual stimulation someone might have are in Playboy magazines. I often worry about whether or not it will dull them to the experiences that they eventually have with humans because they're so immersed in this world of make-believe.
Let me add another point to the make-believe. I have not looked up the exact net worths. I do know she's America's youngest billionaire. That'd be the youngest Kardashian. I wouldn't be surprised if Kim Kardashian is a billionaire and maybe her other sisters. I mean, who knows what the entire net worth of the clan is? What I think is so interesting is here I am. I spend a lot of time in Asia. I love to do yoga. So I'm around a lot of women who are in their 20s and 30s. Asian women are generally smaller busted. They're not the typical Playboy perspective that you might see in the States. When you're around people in person, you find them sexy if you're not immersed in pictures and images. So I bring up the Kardashians because it's such an interesting thing where it's like people have allowed themselves to be fooled. Most of the women in that family are very tiny. They don't probably look like what they look like in pictures in person. That's where I'm rubbing at. Is like, it seems like they're the front line of altering image. We can bring up porn and young men and what's that done to young men. I don't think young women look at porn as much as young men. But what has the Kardashian family done to young women in terms of image consciousness?
Two things. One, women's porn use is on the rise as well. And women tend to watch a lot more different varieties. Women seem to have a broader category of likes.
Is it anywhere close to men, though? Men are just, come on. I can't imagine
It's rising.
it is. Is it?
It's rising, yeah. I mean, I think a recent thing I saw was that Lifetime, 71% of people have watched porn. And I thought that the percentages, the difference between men and women were pretty small. I don't think that it's a big, big difference. But I want to bring to your more salient point, which is you have entire views of what my body should look like are being shaped by media, which almost goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of the show. What we right is being shaped by the watchdogs who own the sites. What we see is being shaped by algorithms owned by the sites. What we want, what we desire in terms of our own bodies and what we're sexually attracted to is also being shaped by the media. I just saw something recently that I don't know the veracity of this, but apparently smaller butts are now coming in. Women, thinner bodies are now coming in. The Kardashians are apparently, or allegedly, someone was saying that they're getting smaller in order to align with this view, whereas their whole aesthetic had been a more shapelier body. People were talking about how it's problematic that this thinner body shape is now coming into be the norm or what's desirable. But the point is, across cultures, you have a body shape that is desirable. And whether it's set by the Kardashians or someone else, once we see it, it's really hard for us to not try to conform to it. And that's something that has existed for a very long time. I mean, my mom grew up in the era of Twiggy. Everyone wanted to be like Twiggy. You didn't have to have social media in order to want to conform to a body type or to desire a certain body type. So I don't think that's changed much.
You happen to be right now, by World Health Organization metrics, my listeners on this podcast, they probably want to kill me for saying this, but you happen to be, by World Health Organization metrics, in the most obese country in the world, except for a few South Pacific islands. I happen to be in the least obese country in the world. So it's interesting when we talk about these body shapes. I find ultimately, if I'm around, that's my thing. I don't care what other people are into. But,
yeah.
You know,
okay.
if I'm around women,
I'm not going to shame you for heterosexuality.
If I'm around women and they are thin and they are in shape, it doesn't really make a difference if their body shapes are all the same. Meaning, I find as a male, if I see a woman who has taken ownership of whatever her genetic lottery gave her, and she's taken ownership and she's run with it and she's working with it, there's going to be variability. I find that sexy. When you see that in person, it's different than looking at a bunch of images online. Because when you see someone in person, maybe she's not as tall. Maybe she is more hippie, but she's worked at, she has no belly or something, whatever. I'm just talking, but she owns it. And in person, that's sexy. Whereas I think somebody might see a picture online, they might think, well, she doesn't look like the Playboy model, but they're missing the point. She's beautiful in person.
There was a recent article that came out that I think you'd really be interested in. They've done a lot of research on whether or not people portray themselves accurately online. One of the studies said that 8 out of 10 people had some falsehood in their dating profile. Either their height, their weight, their age, their picture didn't match. And this was judged by independent raters who said, yeah, their picture does not match who they are. People, when these individuals showed up, got disappointed. Well, a recent study actually looked at what are they disappointed about exactly. There were 2 things that led to longevity in the relationship. One was how they looked and whether or not their looks matched what they said they did. Okay. And the other one was how they used their words. So there was a social aspect that was also missing, which I find super fascinating. But I think the part that you'll find interesting is both of these led to someone, if you lied about what you look like, you had better words online than you did face to face. What happened was people thought you were dishonest. That dishonesty also predicted whether or not you would go on another date. So I think a lot of times it's not that people necessarily don't like what they need when they go on a date with someone who's misrepresented themselves. They might like what they see, but it also makes them feel, maybe this person is inauthentic. And I'm not sure I want to date someone who's inauthentic. To your point, owning who you are is a huge part of, I think, how we get over the social media traps that exist. Let's just own who we are and be honest and see how that goes.
And what's so interesting when you're talking about words, so I'm thinking about, okay, if I'm in a social setting with a woman and she can see me and we're 1 meter apart and I'm saying something like, I'm really hot. Okay, well, I'm not Brad Pitt. Maybe some ladies will think I'm okay, but if in a social setting, if I'm saying that, hey, I'm pretty hot, she knows I'm teasing her a little, so you lose that element when we're in all of these digital universes. It becomes so back to Tinder Swindler,
It does.
Yeah, it shifts right back to just fantasy.
I mean, it is. However, there's something to be said about the online image you can cultivate. You said you wrote 6 books. Is that what you said? A screenplay,
Yeah.
6 books. Okay. So you obviously can write. You obviously know how to spin a phrase. Imagine how advantaged you are then in online dating world where you can use those words to captivate, to seduce, to be witty, and you have the time to make it sound really good. Whereas when you're face to face with someone, it's pressure, it's nonstop. It's a really different kind of communication. My whole point is there's some people who are really, really good at being masterful if they have a little time to think about it. There are other people who are very quick when they're having to just field questions immediately and respond. That mismatch can sometimes be a real relationship killer. The point is, people need to try to see people in as many environments as possible very early on. So anyone who's dating should do that.
Before you slot me as a complete word nerd of only the book variety, remember, I do this podcast and I've been doing it for a little bit of a long time. So, what's interesting about your point, though, it's not a natural skill. Writing or talking, it's not a natural skill. It's practice, period. So if somebody's good at basketball, if somebody can dance, I don't care whatever their skill is, if they're a painter, it's all time. It's just time. You know this in your world.
There are some people who probably are a little bit more natural at it than others. You will have people who spend the same amount of time trying to hone their podcast skills and they just never land. Yet you have. I think that is a skill that some people, yes, you can work at it, but some people are going to be a little bit more natural than others. Writing as well. Some people are going to just be better writers than others. And I certainly was not suggesting that you had writing skills in absence of these face-to-face skills. I think you have both. But I do think those writing skills benefit you in a dating world. I don't foresee a big mismatch between words you use when you're communicating with people online and when you are speaking to them face to face. But for other people, there could be a big mismatch.
One of my favorite things is my mother reading one of my investing books, which was kind of technical, and saying, "This sounds just like you." So there you go.
This sounds just like you. That's really funny.
I'm going to jump you around here. If we get into more the idea of more serious relationships, whether it's a long-term relationship, marriage, how much, and this is kind of connecting the dots on a lot of issues, and this has happened to me. I'm sure some lady could say, well, you've also not perfect, but the notion of cheating and technology and how this is affecting intimacy.
I had read some media headlines years ago that in Italy, WhatsApp had been cited in 1/3 of divorces. Facebook in the United States, I've heard similar statistics. I can't remember his name, but he basically said, if you use Facebook, you're stupid. It leads to so many divorces. What it does is it opens channels of communication that can be pretty covert. You can have people who you're interested in hiding in a pretty harmless list of people who you're connected to. The communication that you have with them can be erased, silenced so that notifications aren't popping up on your phone. Because of that, I think people are really exploring what my co-author, Brandon McDaniel, and I have been talking about, are internet-related infidelity behavior. Talking to people romantically, talking to them about sex, talking to them even about your dreams and hopes in a way that's emotionally intimate. It opens up channels of intimacy that really just didn't exist when you and I were growing up. Because if you wanted to get close to someone, you had to do so either by being with them face to face or calling them on the phone or writing them a letter, all of which would have been traceable or public in some way. This is so much less than that. It's really private.
Here's the problem from my perspective. You can correct me if I'm wrong, or you can add to this or expand on it. If I'm online and I meet this lady, and it really works out well, it goes to offline, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you think to yourself, wow, all those tools, that technology, that stuff was great. I found this woman and it was easy, relatively speaking. It was easy. Then what? Can I do better? Now, where are we?
It's a merry-go-round because when you recognize there are just so many fish in the sea, and I'm convinced there are, I have this quote in my book that says, The average person, I bet you could go on a date every day for the rest of your life and still not meet every person on this earth who you're compatible with. You have a lot of compatibility with probably many, many people. There are lots of people who you could have probably very good relationships with, but it does make you feel like, can I find someone else who's a little bit better than this one? I know if I go online onto my app, hundreds of people will be there available to date me. It does make me wonder about the staying power of these relationships. I will say, I think the statistics are that 1/3 of people have found a serious relationship online, but that doesn't mean that all of those lasted. It is becoming a really popular way to meet people just because it does widen your world. It just makes me wonder, how much is it widening it, and is it making us want to stay?
Choice is a funny thing. I really don't need to. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell that gave a story about this. Maybe it was about spaghetti sauce, and I can't remember what his conclusion was. But if I go into the supermarket, I really don't need a choice of 50 spaghetti sauces. I really don't. If I do have a choice of 50 spaghetti sauces, what is that doing to me? I mean, I feel something. It's back to the same thing with dating. I feel kind of powerful. I feel like, wow, I've got all this choice. I must be really superhuman. All of these women online want to talk to me. I must be Superman.
It's esteem boosting, right? Our esteem needs are legitimate needs. They're basic human motivation, according to Abraham Maslow. We want to feel like we are accomplishing things in this world. And being able to attract a mate is something that people can feel accomplished about. But to your point, yeah, not only do you not need the choice of 50 spaghetti sauces, you're also, when confronted with 50 spaghetti sauces, less likely to buy one. I don't know if you've heard of the jam study, but there's this really famous study. They went into a California grocery store, set up 6 jams or set up 24 jams. When there were 24 jams, more people came to the table. But when they had only 6, more people bought the jam. I think that influx of just being inundated with choice really makes people less likely to choose. Not only that, there are studies that are done on online dating. And when you have so many choices, it can actually lead to worse decision making.
Let me veer this conversation into the unusual and the strange.
Okay.
At least in terms of our current imagination, not unusual to you. You've got some experience about where I'm going to go, but I think it's pretty easy to imagine as technology evolves. And we all know there's some unusual devices out there that people use in their lives. Can I imagine a situation in the not too distant future where are people making the choice to have companionship with artificial intelligence, with robots, with lifelike human? Is that going to be something that's on the horizon? We bring up all these topics. It surely makes me think that, yes, I can see the benefit of the technology at the level we are right now in 2022. You and I are talking about some of the negative aspects, but if I have to look ahead to Blade Runner, boy, it's not pretty.
A lot of what Hollywood portends really captures the darkest parts of us. We fear that robots are going to manipulate us. They're going to adopt the darkest traits of humanity or outsmart us because we know that they already will.
I fear the guys are going to be having sex with robots. That's what I fear, because that's probably not good for society.
If we're talking about just procreation and humanity existing, I think that it always will. We will perpetuate the species either by mandate or just by natural human inclination. I don't see the human species dying out because of lack of interest in sex with humans necessarily.
We're going to do a shift from mask mandates to sex mandates. Is that coming in soon? I mean,
if you foresee a future where people only want to have sex with robots, I'm guessing to maintain humanity, we'll come up with some solution.
I'm not necessarily saying it would be something at all, but it sure seems like it's going to be a path that's going to be explored. I joke about on this podcast, I joke about heavy guys in their mom's basement wearing their tighty whities. Some of these guys, if they don't have to leave the basement and they can still order pizza and drink Coke all day.
There was a recent study that you'd be interested in. I know I'm going to always bring this back to research, but the Kinsey Institute, the biggest sex science institute in the world, really most well-renowned, they came out with a study on novel sex tech and how much actually people are using it. And it led me to write a Medium blog recently that immersive VR is the next frontier of the sexual revolution.
I don't even know what these terms mean. You got to educate me.
Let's talk about it. So sex tech Novel sex tech would be beyond pornography. Pornography and sexting would be now run of the mill sex tech. But things like camming, participating with people who are camming in terms of tipping them or interacting with them, some type of VR experiences, sexting with artificial intelligence, anything that is more immersive was measured in this novel sex tech. And what they found were that these novel sex tech devices were being used by people. If you just do a simple search online for immersive VR, so virtual reality, where you can put on a set of goggles and actually feel like you're with someone and you can pretend like you're touching them. These exist and they have physical devices that sometimes come with them. You can put something on your body that makes you feel the sensations of sex while also participating with your headsets. I think immersive VR is an overlooked trend. First of all, sex, as you know, drives innovation. People want enough sex. Sex is, I think, a natural human desire, at least according to Freud. It's one of our primary desires. It does drive innovation on the internet. Some of the first robots I saw, aside from Sophia, our first robot citizen, I saw as well people were developing sex robots that were pretty non-sophisticated in the AI, in the artificial intelligence sense. They weren't really having super long and in-depth conversations, but from the anthropomorphic sense, so how much they looked like a human body, they look pretty real. They look pretty real. One of the questions I guess I'd pose is, what would be so bad about a person having sex with a robot if that's what they're choosing to do? Especially if we consider 22% of Americans consider themselves incredibly lonely. What about them? Should they be allowed to have sex with whomever that they want, even if that's a robot? I guess I'm pushing the question back to you.
I'm looking at the title of your book, well, the subtitle, The Intimacy Famine. The demand for the products and the tech that you're talking about is coming because the people that are building those products know that famine exists. They know there's an economic demand there for it, rooted in all these different issues that you've explored in your work.
That's right. I mean, and there is a demand.
I don't want to have any guy friends that are hooking up with robots. It's too much information for me. I just have to.
That's interesting. I wonder in our lifetimes if that will change. Robot companions, whether they be friends or sexual companions, will become a mainstay. I read the Clara and the Sun came out recently. I'm a big fan of Kazuo Ishiguro. I think I'm saying his name correctly. I'm certainly not saying his first name, Kazuo, I think Ishiguro. Anyway, he wrote Remains of the Day, Never Let Me Go. He's won prizes for his work. He wrote a book recently, came out, I think, in 2021, Clara and the Sun. It was talking about a future where children have robot companions, and those robot companions assist them with a lot of things. I thought it was interesting that they paired them with children, or even just thinking of the Hollywood blockbusters. If you've ever seen the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, did you see that movie?
I've not seen that one. I've seen a bunch of his films, so I've not seen that one.
It's a really good film. He has an AI assistant that he falls in love with. It's just a voice, and it's played by Scarlett Johansson, who has a really nice voice. She's brilliant and she's always there. She expresses feelings of love for him. And at the end, he kind of recognizes, wait a second, she's always here for me. Are you having conversations with other people? And I think she says something like thousands. Of course I am. I can be everywhere at once. I can be anyone. I don't want to spoil the movie, but it does, again, portend a future where the AI outsmarts us. There are some people, and I'm going to say this, and I think that it will align with some of the things you're saying, but there are some people who just don't have quality conversations in their world. They don't have rich, intellectually stimulating, immersive experiences with others in their world. If AI can fill that spot for them, of course, the manufacturers are going to make that available to them. I guess I'm not sure whether or not that'll be a bad thing. I think everyone deserves some type of companionship, especially the elderly. Over 1/3 of people over the age of 45 say that they're lonely. And as you get over the 65, people become more and more socially isolated. I don't know about you, but I do not want to spend the end of my life desperately alone. If this can fill a gap, maybe not sexually, but if it can fill a gap in some way, I think it should.
You make a case because I want to use the old Michael Jordan or Nike, just do it, but everyone's not going to just do it. That's the tricky part. So you're making the more practical case. It's probably not healthy in a lot of different ways, but it is healthy in terms of solving some of these basic issues that we're talking about. Let me take it back to something that you were hinting at. I thought of the phrase, one of these popular websites out there called OnlyFans, which is a really interesting dynamic because most of my life, okay, there's been the conversation about women entering the workforce and women getting up to speed, so to speak. But these sites, I guess OnlyFans probably is right there on the threshold, depending on what happens, of being porn. But a lot of ladies are making a lot of money on OnlyFans, a lot of money. So you've got a lot of young women that are making a lot of money, which means, back to the intimacy famine, it means there's a lot of lonely guys out there that will pay to watch a lady cut carrots fully clothed or watch her cut carrots with no clothes on. To take it a step further, and I'm going to let you comment on the whole thing. If I'm a guy, though, and I find out that the woman I'm interested in, this is her career, this is what she's doing, it's like, thank you for giving me the filtering system to know what you do for a living in terms of that kind of stuff, because I'm out. On the flip side of that, I respect the hell out of the entrepreneurial aspect of saying, well, hold on, Mike. If these hundreds of lonely guys want to watch me cut carrots, I'm accepting their money. Aren't I taking control and making stuff happen? That whole scenario, though, is ultimately not leading anywhere near normal relationships.
I think what's happening in the last decade, at least, is what we consider a normal relationship is shifting. Maybe a little bit of that is because of technology. It could be because we're constantly connected and we see all of these different options. Let me say one thing that we were studying in my lab is how people are open to selling things online, whether it be selling their underwear or selling their socks. They can be very sexualized or seemingly non-sexualized, but people would be using them potentially in a sexual way.
If I could sell my socks online, I would start doing it tomorrow, really.
You could probably sell your socks online.
Man.
Yes, there are websites that specialize.
A bunch of fat guys buying it probably, and I don't want to know about that.
I don't know. And I'm going to also burst the bubble, like the myth. I don't think this is just people who are lonely, who are engaging in this kind of culture. I just think there's also a little bit of novelty seeking in it. We have this mesolimbic pathway that is in our brains, and it's basically this dopamine rich pathway that gives us all these hits of dopamine, this feel good neurotransmitter when we have novel experiences. I think finding those experiences online, that could appeal to anyone. I don't think it's only the lonely who engage in these behaviors. I think a lot of people just want to experience something new and then maybe get hooked on some things that they maybe didn't know that they wanted. There is every type of fetish advertised online. And I think some people could fall into them just by basic curiosity about searching around the internet. I think that there's a much more open mind among today's youth on a side hustle, making use of the skills that you have, having more than one revenue stream. If selling your socks online or selling your underwear or opening up your cam so people can watch you fully clothed cut carrots is one of those, everyone has their line. To your point about what you'd accept in a relationship, I think that that's also shifting. Let's talk first about just fidelity and commitment. A traditional relationship 40 years ago would have probably been a committed relationship where you have two people who are committed to each other and not having sex with anyone else. Now, I mean, those boundaries are really changing. People are much more open to open relationships and polyamorous relationships. What we see as traditional in sexuality might be changing entirely.
Great point. It'd be interesting to see how that translates across the generations. Obviously, my parents have been married for over 50 years. My grandparents were married for over 50 years. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything was all roses, but that was how things have been done. To take it back also to something you said about new experiences, it's an interesting point to bring up about new experiences online versus offline. I remember the first time I was in Macau, China in 2008. by myself. Me, Macau, China, by myself. You could interview me and I could tell you things. And I think I've told stories to people and they still don't believe me, but I could tell you stories. Most people don't ever find themselves in that situation. They're using the technology to fill a void. I would have to say the in-person in Macau, China is far better than anything you can ever find online, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree completely, of course, but a lot of people don't have the opportunity to do that. I think you've lived, it sounds like, a very rich life. A lot of people's experiences are just more limited, and it's so much easier to go online. It's not as time consuming. It doesn't take as much money. Traveling to Macau takes money, time that a lot of people just don't have, or even just the interest to leave the country. And I think a lot of people also see these online experiences as maybe a little less risky than the face-to-face experiences. Again, that veil of the internet makes it so.
Let me shift you. We've talked just briefly about it, but let me shift you into the pandemic and talk about maybe some of the specifics that you can allow people to understand from your perspective, the intimacy issues that have come. I had a relationship kind of go south during the pandemic. Anyone that's trying to make it seem like the pandemic was easy, maybe if you were already single, when people are confined to particular four walls, so to speak, and they lose their routines. My mother, she lost the routine of going to her church. When they lose their routines, if anyone's observing what's going on, this has had a huge impact on people. And this is a global issue.
Oh, yeah. It's incredibly challenging. Maximally, you were an essential worker. You were out there not only losing your routine and all the structures that you relied upon to keep that routine going, and then also exposing yourself to a potentially deadly illness. That was like the maximum for those essential workers. For the minimum, those of us who had to stay at home, we also, lost a routine. One of my close friends said, now I think about nothing. I used to think about trips and meetings and presentations and those experiences in life where we derive happiness and esteem and connection. And now she just thought about nothing. I think that loss was significant. And what it made us do is face, for some of us, for the first time, the practicalities of being with people for far more time than we'd ever spent with them before. And I'm not sure what eventually led to the downfall or the challenges in the relationship that you're speaking about. But for some people, that much time together really let them see parts of each other that they didn't know existed, parts of each other that were probably experiencing stress unlike they'd felt before. Those stressful times can really make or break a relationship.
The unusual stressor that all of a sudden comes in for people in a situation like this, that's the real kicker. And I think the interesting thing too is, again, back to the intimacy famine, is trying to come out of this situation. Some people aren't going to. They're going to have dating filters where they say, well, I'll potentially go out with you if check the box and it says 1 vax, 2 vax, 3 vax, 4 vax. And then I'm going to have a filter that says I'm not going to be anywhere near a filter that's like that.
Yeah.
It's going to be a mess. It's not logic. People were asked to take certain steps. I want to say that we should all be thinking that maybe we did a little overkill. Okay. But when people change their entire lives to go down this path and they commit to this path, all this change, it's kind of hard to admit that maybe we did overkill. So I think some people are going to stay really, really concerned about this fear for a long time, and it's going to affect intimacy in whole new ways. Your topic is never going to get dry.
I believe that's true, and that makes me sad. But you're right. So in my book, I talk about something called the behavioral immune system. So we all know our regular immune system, but in a prior time where individuals were threatened with a pathogen, researchers actually studied how much distance people stayed from each other. Like, why were they avoiding each other? Just the idea that there's a pathogen in our environment makes a lot of people not want to approach others. not want to engage in any kind of romantic relationship because they're trying to protect themselves, basically. But the extent to which people feel this or experience this is highly variable and individualistic. As we saw during the pandemic, some people were pretty fearless. They wanted to move forward and live their lives the way they'd always lived them. Whereas other people had a lot of fear about contracting an illness, passing on an illness. Maybe they were circumstantially surrounded by people who were vulnerable and didn't want to endanger them. So we're all coming out of it with maybe a very different mind frame, depending on what our situations were. I consider myself lucky in that I didn't really have a very vulnerable person health-wise around me during the pandemic. I have a mother. She's young. She's only 67. She's really, really healthy. I would argue healthier than I am. It was not spending time with her. I didn't feel like, ooh, every time I spend time with you, am I jeopardizing your life? A lot of people did. More than 5 million people died. And a neighbor of mine, she lost her mother, who was also quite young. And I think those scars, depending on where you're coming from out of the pandemic, those scars can shift what you're looking for in the future. I do think, though, I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are, Mike. I do think there'll be this rebound effect where we're going to want to engage with others deeply because we've been missing it for the last couple of years.
I hope so. Let me shift it to all of us getting older. It's a common problem for everyone. This is the area where I think tech is fabulous. We've talked about it a little bit. I watch some older people in my life. I can think of one person. Wow, he's just completely in on all the tech. He's figured out a way to watch, to view, to communicate, to find groups. And I can think of somebody else, and she's not figured it out. It's such a great opportunity for older people, but for the people that are older right now, they didn't grow up with it and they don't have a sense of it. I'll give an example also. My grandmother died, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and she got to age 100. Her mother got to age 101. My grandmother that got to age 100, she got to age 100 and she said, okay, that's it. Get the blackout. I'm ready to go. She stopped eating and said she was ready to go. She was staying at a nice assisted place, but all of her friends had died. She didn't know how to find new people. She didn't have any earthly idea how to use a computer or a phone or anything to have chats with other older friends. I'm convinced that if she would have known how to use Zoom or whatever, and she could talk with other people, why would she want to leave? She wanted to leave because she was isolated, because it was not enough for just what she had. She wanted what she had her whole life, and she didn't have that anymore.
Yeah. Your story echoes the one that I tell about my grandmother, who was 93 when she died, so didn't make it to 100, but she was also blind, which I think complicated her learning of technology and her connections in general. She was a very social person all her life, even with her blindness. Even the day she died, I remember wheeling her down to the room where she would have breakfast. She forced herself to eat some toast and eggs for me very delicately. It was very sweet, but I remember we passed by another person in a wheelchair and they said, Neola, that's my grandmother's name. And she's like, is that Betty? Oh, Betty. And she asked Betty if she was wearing a new sweater. And Betty said, no, it's my old sweater. And my grandmother was blind. And I thought she had these social graces that didn't leave her. But I often wonder if she had had a robotic friend, for example, who talked to her. She listened to books on tape pretty much all day, every day. That's the silent world where she lived, cut off from the rest of the world. And I thought, how much would her life have been enriched if she had had an AI or a robotic companion who could have talked to her about the book she was reading and engage her in stimulating conversations? Maybe it would have given her something to hold on to, because like your grandmother, my grandmother just didn't want to live anymore. Everyone she had known, except for her children and grandchildren, had died. The average life expectancy in those assisted living facilities is about 2 years. She had had so many people come in and out. She had lived there more than a decade. The nurses' aides even changed a lot. You are citing, to me, the most promising part of this tech, which is the ability for it to fill large gaps in social isolation, especially as we age.
I will offer a suggestion. People aren't going to do it exactly like me. It's taken a lot of time to do a podcast. It's taken a lot of time to meet this network of people, like the way that we got introduced, etc. That's not easy. That takes a lot of time. But I do think these ways of communicating, sharing conversations with strangers, this can happen on all kinds of fronts. It doesn't necessarily have to be a high-level academic or Nobel Prize winner or whatever. I mean, there's ways to have conversations with all kinds of strangers that can be interesting. For me, it just happens that I get to talk to people that are doing really cool stuff about every subject under the sun. First 2 years of this podcast, I was only talking about investing topics. And after a while, I was like, man, this isn't going to cut the mustard. And I figured out a way to get Daniel Kahneman to come on this podcast, the Nobel Prize winner. And once I had him on, I started sending out invites to anybody I was remotely interested in. It had nothing to do with investing. People weren't going to say no because I talked to Kahneman. I set this up because if I look ahead to the future, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I plan to get to over 100. That's my plan. Why would I want to stop talking to people? Talking to you, like, okay, you bring up interesting issues about a topic that I don't live in the middle of, but I have to get in there with you and I have to play ball and figure out what makes you tick. That's fun. People lose that sense of fun.
They do. If we're going to have an intimate moment for me as I walk away, because intimacy is all in your own perception, this is it right now, because I think you're really speaking to a truth of mine, which is when I've walked away from these interviews, I've always felt quite intimately connected to the people with whom I speak, because I think it's a unique thing that you get to do here. Yet that same feeling, although not as intense, I could think if you're not really diving into an intellectual topic that someone else feels passionately about, but like that, just talking to strangers. People don't have to have a podcast to have an interesting conversation with strangers. There are these whole sets of experiments that they did outside of Chicago or in Chicago. They approached people on buses and on trains, and they said to them, hey, you can do what you normally do, or we want you to think about what you're going to do today, or we want you to talk to a stranger. And then they had them do that. And at the end of the ride, they said, okay, how was it? And the people who had talked to a stranger had a better time than the people who had either did what they usually did or just thought about what they were going to do that day. They were surprised by that. And when other people were asked, who's going to have more fun? The people who were in the talk to the stranger condition were not the ones who were expected to have the most fun. But it's because people make what's called forecasting errors, which sounds probably very much like what your investment listeners would like to hear. But forecasting errors, people predict wrongly how they're going to feel when they talk to strangers. They think they're not going to have a good time, and they do. And this is especially true of introverts. People who are more introverted are not expecting to have a good time. I think you're 100% correct. There's research that supports what you say, in that the diversity of our social network actually promotes longevity. It promotes illness repulsion, so our ability to fight off illness. It promotes happiness. The longest longitudinal study of the 1937 study of Harvard men, so it's called the Grant study, and its companion is the Gluick study. And they've been picking and prodding and testing and measuring these men for more than now 80 years. And the single largest contribution this study has made to humanity is that it's really valuable to have good relationships in your life. Why not talk to people? Why not dive deep and ask them how they feel and how they think? You're exactly right.
I'm only here because of stranger conversations. My entire business is built on stranger conversations. I'm not so sure how or why or when I figured out the magic of stranger conversations, but I have definitely observed that most people don't like the idea of stranger conversations.
Again, that's a forecasting error. They don't like the idea, but once they're in it, they do like it. And I think if a lot of people were allowed to sit in your seat for a little while, they would see the magic. They would see what you're getting from it, because it really is a high, isn't it? Afterwards, your brain has changed, in every moment.
Yes, I can't go
changed.
to sleep fast. Yes, that's a problem.
It's opening your world in ways that make you think in different ways. That novelty part of our brains, that novelty seeking, it's satisfying that. And we're naturally, as humans, we're also infovores. So we want information. And here you are getting a concentrated set of information from someone who spent their lifetimes usually studying that topic. So you're getting this intense crash course in something that someone's passionate about. I can see if it causes you to stir and not be able to fall asleep.
You get me thinking about business ideas. I can imagine a situation, maybe the Tinder of stranger conversations. So it's not even about dating. It's literally stranger conversations. That's the trigger. And it's like, how can you, maybe the stranger conversations are categorized by whatever topic or whatever you could jump into. Clubhouse probably does this to some degree, but
Clubhouse kind of does it. The moderators are the ones who are usually speaking, and they often are not strangers. So you're not really communicating with strangers. I think John Mayer had a tweet, I think it was even like a decade ago, where he said, everyone who's on hold with customer service should be allowed to talk to each other. And I thought, that's brilliant. We should. Yeah. What a great way to spend our time that's usually wasted on customer service. He really put his finger on the pulse of, I think, what you're saying and what I definitely endorse, which is we could actually form valuable connections with others instead of the time we waste doing lots of things that we don't want to do. Yeah, your stranger conversations business idea. It's the old party lines from our youth where you had to pay $1 a minute and go online to talk to people. And it's the modern day Discord. You can go into a Discord room and talk to strangers. That is both a problem of the internet for youth who get in and find themselves in dangerous water, and even adults. But it's also, I think, the really interesting thing about the internet.
Well, the funny thing is too, is look how many people go to college and their dorm mate becomes their friend for life. Where do we think friends come from? It's ultimately everyone's a stranger at some stage of the game.
Exactly.
K through 12 or K through college, we define it as something different. Then we get older and we kind of stop that whole process.
Yeah. I mean, some of my strongest connections have been built by these happenstance connections. We didn't grow up together. We just happened to meet. Those connections were strong. One thing I think that people don't count on, but our genes really drive us towards the places and people that we could really connect with. We have this, it's called this active environment gene connection, where we are actively seeking out, or we're niche picking the people with whom we could strongly connect. Trust your instincts. Go to the places your passions take you. And you're likely to meet people there who share your passions, who might be your strongest connections ever. But getting back to what I think is the intimacy famine, we then have to make really intentional social choices to engage with people, or those connections can always feel quite distal. You and I, we'll just take us as an example. This could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We could be friends for 50 years because you're going to live to 100. You're going to be one of those centurions. Or we could let it melt away and I could send a thank you note, and then this could be all that we ever speak. I think every day you're faced with those kinds of decisions, whether they be with existing friends or people that you just meet, and you have to decide where to put your effort.
It's hard with a podcast, I have to admit. I find generally I am selective. I generally pick people and topics that look interesting to me. And I've got some kind of a vetting or filtering system in my head that is just kind of, okay, that works. And I'll say, okay, the weeks go by. It's tough, especially when you're online. Everyone on both sides would have to take the next step to something. I get to hide out in Asia, which makes it a little bit harder to connect with me too.
I'm part of this group where all these connections are made, and someone did something that was really valuable in this group. It was a connection that was made, and she's like, here's my phone number. Just call me sometimes. She's a very, very busy person. So I tried to call her. She was like, look, I'm just stepping out. I'll try to call you later this week. I've now gotten in the habit of when I send an introductory email, I just say, here's my number. Call me anytime if I'm available. We can talk. And then sometimes those conversations are 2 to 3 minutes. Hey, how's your day? What's going on? What's cool in your world? But it's a way of connecting that feels deeper and richer than just sending an email or sending a text message. I've gotten into that habit, and I think that helps me connect with people on what I see as a really valuable level.
All great points. And the tough part too about everything we've talked about today is all the forces, and we don't have time to go into this, but all the forces that are working against us to keep us moving into these paths. So many other choices that we can do to try to pretend we're filling the void of intimacy, watching some kind of streaming channel, something, another, whatever. I mean, there's all these streams of information rolling at us, and that can keep us away from solving the very issues that you're going after.
That's exactly right. The internet is really the desired path to quick connection, but those connections may not be very filling. these desire paths form naturally to get us where we want to go quicker. It gives you, as I've said, these little hits of dopamine. But what you're missing out on is maybe those larger floods of oxytocin that when you really get deep with someone, you can sit with them side by side, you can hug them or kiss them or hold their hands, or you could actually develop these deeper feelings of intimacy. It's exactly right. I think the biggest limiter for most people is time. I don't feel like I have the time to invest at the end of the night to calling a friend because I'm just laying in bed with my husband. But I do have a few minutes where I can scroll on social media, like, comment, and make my friends feel, here I am looking at you. I'm a witness to your life.
Michelle, great stuff. Fun conversation. The book, Out of Touch, How to Survive an Intimacy Famine. People will have to take the deep dive and get into all the details. You go into a lot more than I've just kind of taken you around the maypole and a lot of different topics, but you do the deep dive and people can definitely get some insights on how to navigate this. Like I said at the top of the show, this is something that we all have to deal with.
Yeah, it is. And it's not just us in our daily lives. We have to be thinking about the world in general and how people are faring and growing and how this is changing who we are as humans. Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for having me.
Michelle, where can we send people? Where would you like to direct them? Twitter, website, any place in particular?
Twitter at Dr. M. Drouin. They can connect with me on Instagram, dr.michelledrouin, or drmichelledrouin.com is my website. On my website, they can find links to the book.
Cool. Michelle, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm jealous that you're in Asia right now. That's great. Enjoy yourself. It was great to have this conversation. We certainly covered topics that I've not covered with anyone else. You win the prize for ingenuity. You're definitely the novel. You're just very honest with the way that you're approaching these ideas. So that's really cool. Thank you for doing it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.